A single, sharp snap of fingers echoed through the candlelit room, cutting through the low murmur of Valentine's Day romance like a gunshot. Shanaa didn't flinch, but the air around her suddenly felt cold. At the center of the restaurant, Evan Whitmore leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he tipped his glass. The water didn't just spill. It was a deliberate, slow pour that soaked into the expensive carpet and splashed against Shanaa's polished shoes. "You missed a spot, sweetheart," Evan drawled, his voice loud enough to turn every head in the room. "And on a night like this, everything should be perfect. Now get down and show me how well you can clean up a mess." Shanaa stood perfectly still. Her uniform was crisp, her natural hair styled with quiet care, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons, wealthy, powerful people who suddenly found their menus fascinating rather than witness the public degradation of a woman whose only crime was working a double shift to pay her bills. To them, she was part of the furniture. To Evan, she was an object to be broken for his amusement. Evan laughed, the sound entitled and hollow. He pulled out his phone, ready to capture her humiliation for his followers, treating her dignity like cheap entertainment. Shanaa began to lower herself, her knees touching the cold floor as she reached for her cloth, her composure a fragile shield against his unchecked immaturity. But in the far corner booth, the atmosphere shifted. Shin Min-seong sat perfectly still. He had been observing the room with the detached air of a man who had seen everything, his hand resting lightly on the stem of a crystal glass. But as Evan's laughter echoed, hollow, entitled, and sharp, Min-seong's thumb paused against the glass. He didn't move, yet the atmosphere around his table seemed to densify, turning heavy with a silent, gathering storm. His eyes, usually a calm and impenetrable dark, underwent a subtle, terrifying transformation. The warmth of the candlelight reflected in them, but it didn't find a soft place to land. Instead, it hit a surface as hard and cold as flint. He saw the way Shanaa's shoulders remained square even as she knelt, a testament to a resilience that Evan Whitmore would never understand. He saw the flicker of genuine cruelty in the younger man's smirk, a loud, performative power that lacked even a shred of earned honor. Shin Min-seong, a man whose presence usually acted as a silent anchor in any room, carefully set down his silk napkin. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the gesture of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. He rose from his seat, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the table. His eyes, usually calm and observant, had changed. Behind them flickered a cold, focused calculation, not of violence, but of a deep, principled disgust for the scene before him. Evan Whitmore was about to learn that while his family's name could buy a table, it couldn't buy the room. What he doesn't realize is that he's being watched by a man who moves in silence and commands the shadows. Why is a powerful leader like Shin Min-seong risking everything for a waitress he's never met? And what happens when quiet authority finally speaks back to loud arrogance? If you believe that true power is found in respect, not intimidation, hit that like button and subscribe now. You won't want to miss how this Valentine's Day turns into a lesson the elite will never forget. Let's get back to our story. The Whitmore name has been synonymous with Manhattan real estate for 3 generations, but Evan is the first to treat that legacy as a playground rather than a responsibility. His father, a man who built skyscrapers out of sheer willpower, spent so much time constructing skylines that he forgot to build a son. Evan grew up in penthouses, where the silence was only broken by the sound of staff fulfilling his every whim. He never learned the value of a dollar because he never saw one earned. He only saw them spent to make problems disappear. His arrogance isn't born from true confidence, but from a deep-seated insecurity, a fear that without his father's checkbook, he is entirely invisible. He confuses being feared with being respected, and his cruelty toward Shanaa is a desperate attempt to feel large in a world where he has never truly grown up. Evan Whitmore stood like a conquering king, his designer loafers inches from her hands. He didn't just want the floor clean, he wanted to see her spirit bow. "I said every drop, Shanaa," Evan drawled, his voice cutting through the hushed whispers of the Valentine's crowd. He leaned down, the sharp scent of his cologne overwhelming the floral air. It's a simple task for someone of your pedigree. Or is the lighting too dim for you to see your place? A few of his companions snickered, the sound like breaking glass in the sudden silence of the dining room. Shanaa didn't look up. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, clinging to the quiet dignity that had seen her through 1,000 such shifts. Shanaa was raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep Shanaa and her younger brother in a safe school district. Shanaa learned early that dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you protect. She was a gifted student with dreams of studying interior architecture, but when her mother fell ill during her sophomore year of college, Shanaa didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the classroom and into the service industry, trading her textbooks for a waitress's apron to ensure her brother stayed on his path to a degree. Her invisible nature isn't a sign of weakness. It is the tactical calm of a woman who knows that her value isn't defined by the people she serves, but by the family she sustains. She was a woman who had learned to be invisible to survive, but tonight, Evan was determined to make her a spectacle. Minseong carefully set his napkin on the table, the silk folding into itself with a soft, final hiss. The gesture was unhurried, yet it signaled the end of his patience. He was a man who valued silence, but he valued balance more. As he rose, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the decorative sconce behind him, he didn't look at the air. His focus was entirely on the woman on the floor. The tiger had seen enough. The time for observation had passed, and the room was about to learn that some shadows carry the weight of a mountain. The air in the bistro remained thick with the echoes of Evan Whitmore's jagged laughter, but Shin Minseong moved through the tension as if he were walking through a quiet garden. He ignored the air entirely, treating the loud, posturing man like a flickering shadow that held no substance. Minseong reached the center of the room and came to a halt beside Shanaa. He didn't tower over her. Instead, he inclined his head with a subtle, courtly grace, his presence acting as a silent barrier between the waitress and the mocking gaze of the crowd. With a slow, deliberate movement, Minseong reached into the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal coat and withdrew a silk handkerchief, pristine and white. He didn't hand it to her as a master might hand a tool to a servant. He offered it as a peer might offer a gift. "There is no need for you to be on the floor," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried a weight of authority far greater than Evan's shrill demands. "The mess is merely water. It will dry. Your dignity, however, is not something that should ever be dampened." Shanaa looked up, her fingers still clutching the damp linen cloth. For the first time in years, she felt someone looking not at her uniform, but at her. In Minseong's calm eyes, she saw a reflection of the strength she usually kept hidden, the resilience of the woman who had walked away from an architecture degree to nurse a sick mother and shield a younger brother from the cold realities of debt. She had spent a decade making herself small so others could feel large, but under Minseong's steady gaze, that habit felt suddenly unnecessary. He extended a steady hand to help her rise. As she took it, the contact was brief but grounding, a silent promise of stability in a room that had turned hostile. Evan began to bark a protest, his face twisting as he realized he was being systematically erased from the conversation, but Minseong simply turned his shoulder slightly, effectively editing the air out of their world. "The management here has forgotten their purpose," Minseong said, his tone conversational yet final. He reached into his pocket once more and produced a card, heavy and embossed with a minimalist silver crest. He didn't press it upon her. He waited for her to accept it. "You possess a composure that is rare in any industry. If you find that this environment can no longer contain your worth, call the number on this card. It is time you worked for someone who understands that the most valuable asset in any room is character." As Shanaa took the card, her fingers brushing the expensive cardstock, she realized she wasn't just being rescued. She was being seen. Minseong's respect was a quiet revolution, a level of honor that turned the upscale bistro into a common room and the billionaire's son into a footnote. For the first time in her life, Shanaa didn't just survive a shift, she stood tall within it. The silence following Shin Min-seong's departure was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a collapse. Evan Whitmore stood in the center of the bistro. His face flushed a humiliated shade of crimson that clashed with the romantic red roses on the tables. The foreigner in the charcoal suit had not raised a hand, yet Evan felt as though he had been stripped bare in front of Manhattan's elite. He could feel the judgmental weight of the room shifting. The patrons weren't looking at him with the usual deference reserved for a Whitmore. They were looking at him with the quiet disdain one might reserve for a child throwing a tantrum in a gallery. Desperate to reclaim the narrative, Evan's insecurity curdled into a cold, performative rage. He didn't look at the wet floor or the trembling woman who had just been offered a lifeline. Instead, he reached for the only weapon he knew how to wield: his phone. His thumbs flew across the screen, the light from the device casting sharp, ugly shadows across his features. He wasn't just a man with a trust fund. He was a man with connections that reached into every kitchen, lounge, and five-star lobby in the city. "You think a handkerchief and a business card save you?" Evan hissed, his voice trembling with an immaturity that highlighted his total lack of character. He ignored his date, who was now looking at him with visible second-hand embarrassment, and dialed a direct line to the restaurant's ownership group. As the call connected, he paced the small area of the marble floor, his loud gestures filling the room in a desperate bid to reassert his dominance. He spoke loudly, making sure every server heard him. He demanded that Shanaa not only be fired by the end of the night, but that her name be circulated through the hospitality blacklists, a digital exile that would ensure she never carried a silver tray in this zip code again. He spoke of standards and unprofessionalism, wrapping his petty vengeance in the language of business. He represented a specific kind of inherited privilege that confused attention with respect and obedience with loyalty. To Evan, power was a hammer meant for crushing anything that bruised his ego. He ended the call with a smug, jagged smile, looking down at Shanaa as if she were already a ghost. He truly believed he had won. He didn't realize that while he was busy burning bridges, Shin Min-seong was already rebuilding the entire landscape. Evan had the loud, clattering power of a falling tree, but he lacked the quiet, rooted character of the man who now held Shanaa's future in his steady hands. As Evan stormed out of the bistro, he felt large, unaware that in the eyes of everyone remaining, he had never looked smaller. The following evening, the rain in Brooklyn fell in a steady, rhythmic pulse against the glass of Shanaa's cramped apartment. She sat at her small kitchen table, the heavy, silver-embossed card Shin Min-seong had given her resting beside a stack of medical bills and her brother's university registration forms. Evan Whitmore's vengeful phone call had worked. The bistro's manager had fired her via text message before she even reached the subway. Shanaa traced the edge of the card, her mind drifting back to her junior year of architecture school, the way she used to map out structural integrity and flow. She had traded those blueprints for shift schedules to keep her family afloat, but the structural integrity of her own life now felt perilously thin. A soft, low hum vibrated through the floorboards, different from the rattling of the nearby elevated train. Shanaa looked out her window to see a sleek black sedan idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the New York fog like the eyes of a silent predator. There was no aggressive honking, no flashy display. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding an umbrella with practiced precision, and waited. When Shanaa reached the street, the driver didn't open the door with a flourish of ownership. He simply inclined his head. "Mr. Shin sends his regards, Ms. Morgan. He noticed the bistro chose to lose its most valuable asset. He would like to offer you a different kind of blueprint." Inside the car, the scent of sandalwood and old books replaced the city's damp exhaust. There was a leather-bound folder waiting for her. As the car glided toward the lights of Manhattan, Shanaa opened it. It wasn't a contract for service. It was a formal proposal for a logistics manager position for the Shin estate. The documents outlined the management of international shipments, private security transit, and the complex architecture of a global household. It was a role that required the very structural mind she had been forced to suppress. Min-seong wasn't offering her a handout. He was offering a headquarters. He had seen past the waitress apron to the woman who managed chaos with a smile, the woman who maintained the load-bearing walls of her family without a single complaint. This wasn't an attempt to buy her silence or her beauty. It was an investment in her competence. As the car crossed the bridge, Shanaa looked at the skyline, no longer feeling like a ghost haunting the city's fringes. For the first time, she wasn't just looking for a way to survive the night. She was looking at a way to build a future. The private dining room was a sanctuary of cedarwood and soft amber light, tucked away from the relentless mechanical heartbeat of the city. There were no snapping fingers here, no loud demands for attention. Instead, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic pour of tea into delicate porcelain. Shin Min-seong sat across from Shanaa, his tailored jacket removed to reveal a crisp shirt that spoke of the same disciplined restraint he carried in his posture. He watched her as she navigated the table with a quiet, observant grace, the same composure she had held while kneeling on a cold bistro floor. "You look at the room differently than most guests, Shanaa," Min-seong noted, his voice a low, steady anchor in the silence. Shanaa hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "I was an architecture student before life became about surviving the next shift," she admitted, her gaze sweeping over the seamless joinery of the room. "I tend to look for the load-bearing walls. I like to know what is holding everything up." Min-seong nodded slowly, a look of genuine recognition crossing his features. "In my world, we call that discipline. Most people only see the facade, the gold leaf, the silk, the power, but the structure is built on things that are invisible: control, principles, the ability to remain still when the world is screaming." As they spoke, the silence between them transformed. It was no longer the awkward quiet of two strangers from different worlds, but a shared language of survivors. Shanaa spoke of the years spent balancing the weight of her family's future on her shoulders, moving with a tactical calm that allowed no room for her own exhaustion. Min-seong, in turn, shared the heavy reality of his own history, a life spent in the high-stakes security of the Korean elite, where a single lapse in self-control meant total collapse. He had spent his life protecting others, often at the cost of his own peace, searching for a standard of honor that the loud, chaotic world seemed to have forgotten. "Evan Whitmore thinks power is a noise," Min-seong said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that was both formidable and deeply gentle. "He thinks it is. The ability to make someone else small. But true power is the architecture of the soul. It is the strength to be kind when it is easier to be cruel." Shanaa felt a shift in the air, a sense of structural integrity she hadn't felt since before her mother fell ill. She realized that Min-seong didn't just want a logistics manager. He wanted someone who understood that honor was a discipline, not a costume. In the soft light of the tea room, the waitress and the tiger found their common ground. They were both builders, people who understood that the strongest foundations are those laid in the dark, held together by principles that no amount of wealth could buy. As the tea cooled, the gap between their worlds vanished, replaced by a silent, unbreakable respect. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, a place where the air itself tasted of champagne and old money. Evan Whitmore moved through the crowd with his usual restless energy, his laughter a bit too loud, his gestures a bit too wide. He felt at home here, surrounded by the skylines his father had built, basking in the inherited void of his own reputation. He had spent the last few weeks convinced he had erased Shanaa Morgan from existence, a minor glitch in his perfect Valentine's Day that he had successfully deleted with a single phone call. To Evan, power was the ability to make people disappear. He didn't realize that true power was the ability to make them shine. A sudden hush rippled through the ballroom, the kind of silence that usually preceded the arrival of royalty. Evan turned, a smirk already forming on his face, expecting to see another business associate he could charm or intimidate. Instead, his glass slipped slightly in his grip. Entering the room on the arm of Shin Min-seong was a woman who seemed to have stepped out of a masterpiece. Shanaa didn't wear the loud, diamond-encrusted labels that defined the other women in the room. She was dressed in understated luxury, a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that moved like water, its only ornament a vintage silver brooch pinned at her shoulder. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant, architectural crown that highlighted the quiet confidence in her eyes. She didn't look like a waitress playing dress-up. She looked like the load-bearing wall of the entire event, the only person in the room with a foundation deep enough to hold the weight of the moment. Minseong walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her elbow, his presence a silent shield that rendered Evan's previous taunts laughable. He didn't look for Evan, but as they passed the Heir, Minseong's gaze flickered toward him for a fraction of a second, a look of clinical indifference that hurt more than any physical blow. It was the look of a man who had already forgotten the name of the insect he had stepped on. Evan stood frozen, his face burning a deep, humiliated red. The whispers around him weren't about his father's new skyscraper. They were about the woman he had tried to blacklist, now standing as the guest of honor for a man whose influence dwarfed the Whitmore estate. Shanaa didn't offer Evan the satisfaction of a glare or a triumphant smile. When her eyes briefly met his, there was only a calm, disarming sincerity. She looked at him and saw exactly what he was. A boy with power but no character, a loud noise in a room that had finally learned to value silence. In that moment, the reversal was complete. Evan was the one who felt invisible, while Shanaa, the woman he had tried to break, moved through the light, untouchable and whole. The champagne bubbles in the ballroom seemed to lose their sparkle as Evan Whitmore's desperation reached a fever pitch. He could feel the social landscape of the gala shifting beneath his feet, the gravity of the room pulling away from him and toward the woman he had tried to bury. To Evan, Shanaa's presence was a glitch in the social order, a defiance of the laws of wealth he had lived by. He couldn't stand the way the city's power players looked at her with genuine interest, or how they leaned in when she spoke of structural logistics with the same precision she had once used to balance a serving tray. Driven by a curdling mix of insecurity and spite, Evan cut through a circle of influential investors, his voice rising to a pitch that signaled a frantic loss of control. "It's a lovely masquerade, isn't it?" he announced, his gaze darting around to ensure he had an audience. He pointed a trembling finger toward Shanaa, a jagged smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "But let's be honest. A few weeks ago she was scrubbing my spills off a bistro floor. She's a waitress, people, a servant who got lucky with a patron. Don't tell me you're all actually falling for this logistics act." A heavy, suffocating silence followed his outburst. Evan stood tall, waiting for the familiar sound of snickering, for the collective recoil of the elite as they realized. They had been breathing the same air as the help. He expected the room to reset, for Shanaa to shrink back into the shadows where he believed she belonged. But the silence didn't break in the way Evan expected. Instead of turning toward Shanaa with judgment, the guests turned toward Shin Minseong. The Korean leader didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge Evan's existence with a glance. Minseong simply took a slow sip of his mineral water, his calm, clinical focus remaining entirely on the conversation he had been having with a prominent philanthropist. Seeing Minseong's lead, the rest of the room followed suit with devastating efficiency. A senator turned her back to Evan to ask Shanaa for her opinion on urban development. The CEO of a major tech firm stepped into Evan's line of sight, physically editing him out of the circle as if he were a piece of stray lint. The exposure had failed because the room had moved beyond the shallow definitions of pedigree that Evan clung to. They saw a woman with unshakable composure and a man with the discipline to protect her, and by comparison, Evan looked like a loud, disruptive child at a symphony. He stood in the center of the ballroom, his secret revealed and yet completely ignored. He had tried to use her past as a weapon, but the room had decided that her character was the only currency that mattered. Evan was left holding his malice like a handful of dust, realizing too late that in a world of quiet authority, the loudest voice is often the most invisible. The gala continued to swirl around them in a blur of gold and silk, but for Shanaa, the air had grown thin. As the initial adrenaline of the confrontation faded, a cold, familiar doubt began to creep in. She looked at the midnight blue silk of her sleeves, then at the powerful men and women laughing nearby, and felt like a structural anomaly, a beautiful design built on a foundation that didn't match the soil. When Minseong led her to a quiet balcony overlooking the city's glowing arteries, she finally voiced the fear that had been gnawing at her since the sedan first arrived at her doorstep. "Evan was right about one thing," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the distant lights of Brooklyn. "I know how to manage your logistics, and I know how to navigate this room because I've spent years watching it from the edges. But I don't belong here, Minseong. I'm a load-bearing wall made of scrap wood in survival trying to hold up a palace." Minseong didn't offer a hollow platitude. He stepped up to the railing, his profile sharp against the moonlit skyline. For a long moment he was silent, the tiger retreating into the memories of a life he rarely spoke of. "When I first arrived in the city," he began, his voice barely louder than the wind, "I had no charcoal suits. I had no name that anyone feared or respected. I was a man who had been forged in the high-intensity discipline of a world that didn't want me to succeed. I spent my first 3 years in a kitchen much smaller than the one you worked in, scrubbing floors until my hands bled." Shanaa turned to him, surprised by the raw honesty in his tone. "I had to learn a new language, not just with my tongue but with my soul," he continued. "I had to adapt, to observe, and to survive. Every brick of the empire I lead today was laid by the hands of a man who was once considered the help. You think your past makes you a fraud in this room, Shanaa, but I see it as your greatest strength. This room is full of people who have never known a storm. They are fragile structures. You, however, have been tested by the tide. You don't belong here because of the dress or the guest list. You belong here because you are the only person in that ballroom who truly understands what it takes to keep a ceiling from falling." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the steady, unwavering light of the city. "Stop making yourself small to fit into their narrow hallways. The palace isn't what matters, Shanaa. It's the person who knows how to maintain the foundation." For the first time, Shanaa didn't feel like a guest in Minseong's world. She realized they were both architects of their own survival, two people who had turned the grit of the struggle into the grace of authority. The fear of not belonging didn't vanish, but it transformed into a quiet, unbreakable pride. The air on the balcony was cool, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom had reached a fever pitch of whispered judgment. Evan Whitmore, cornered by his own obsolescence, refused to go quietly into the night. He saw Shanaa and Minseong standing together against the skyline, a silhouette of unified strength, and it flickered a final, desperate fuse in his mind. He didn't just want to embarrass Shanaa anymore. He wanted to dismantle the very foundation Minseong had built for her. He stormed back toward the center of the room, intercepting the gala's chairperson, a woman whose family had governed Manhattan's social registers for a century. "Mrs. Sterling," Evan interjected, his voice cracking with a frantic, sharp edge. "I assume the board wasn't informed that your guest of honor has a history of professional instability. I have the records from her previous employer. She was dismissed for gross incompetence and misconduct. If this is the new standard for the plaza, my family will be reconsidering our endowment." It was the ultimate gamble, a direct threat to the institution's pockets. The music seemed to dim as Mrs. Sterling turned her icy gaze toward Evan, then toward Shanaa, who was just re-entering the room. Shanaa didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't let her breath hitch or her eyes dart in panic. Instead, she walked forward with the calm, measured pace of an architect reviewing a site. When she reached the circle, she didn't look at Evan. She looked directly at Mrs. Sterling. "Misconduct is an interesting choice of words, Mr. Whitmore," Shanaa said, her voice like velvet wrapped around steel. "If by misconduct you mean refusing to accept the humiliation you tried to buy with a glass of water, then I am guilty. But Mrs. Sterling is a woman who values structural integrity. She knows that a business that fires its best assets to protect a bully's ego is a business that is already failing." Minseong stepped into the light beside her, his presence alone enough to make the air grow heavy. He didn't offer an angry rebuttal. He simply produced a small, leather-bound ledger from his pocket and handed it to Mrs. Sterling. Those are the performance metrics for the Shin Estate's logistics over the last 30 days under Ms. Morgan's direction, he said quietly. A 20% increase in efficiency and a complete restoration of our archival integrity. My family doesn't make endowments, Evan. We make acquisitions, and I have just acquired the debt of the Whitmore Holding Company's primary lender. The color drained from Evan's face, leaving him a ghastly, hollow white. Mrs. Sterling didn't even open the ledger. She simply looked at Evan's trembling hands and then back to Shanaa's unshakable composure. Character is the only currency that doesn't devalue, Evan, she said, her voice dripping with a finality that signaled his social exile. And you are currently bankrupt. The room didn't erupt in laughter. It simply moved on. The elite turned their backs, a collective, silent wall of indifference that was far more painful than any jeer. Evan stood in the center of the floor, a paper tiger in a storm, finally realizing that the world he thought he owned had never belonged to him at all. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the bistro, no longer casting sharp, judgmental glares, but a warm, golden glow that softened the edges of the marble and mahogany. The space had been transformed. The rigid, cold hierarchy that once defined the room had been dismantled, replaced by the humming energy of a cooperative foundation dedicated to empowering those the city usually preferred to keep invisible. Shanaa Morgan moved through the center of the room, not with the hurried, defensive gait of a woman trying to avoid a spill, but with the fluid, architectural grace of a leader who had finally stepped into the light. She was no longer wearing a server apron. Instead, she wore a simple, tailored cream office gown that spoke of her new role as the foundation's director. She stopped at a table to speak with a young trainee, her smile genuine and disarming, the kind of inner stability that Evan Whitmore had never been able to break. Shanaa had taken the debris of her past, the struggle for her family, the humiliation of that Valentine's Day, and the resilience she had forged in the shadows, and used it to build a sanctuary. She was the load-bearing wall of this new venture, and the structure was unbreakable. In the corner booth, the same shadows that had once concealed a tiger now held a man who had found his peace. Shin Minseong sat with his usual unhurried composure, his silk napkin resting beside a cup of tea. He watched Shanaa as she navigated the room, nodding the way people stood taller when she passed. He had watched her transition from survival to thriving, from being rescued to being the one who restored balance for others. Minseong didn't need to announce his presence with loud gestures or grand displays of wealth. His power remained quiet, rooted in the principles of discipline and respect that they now shared like a private language. As Shanaa finished her rounds, her eyes drifted toward the corner. She didn't look at him with the subservience of an employee or the frantic gratitude of a victim. She looked at him as an equal, a partner who understood that the strongest foundations are those held together by love and honor. She walked over to the booth. Shin Minseong sat with his usual unhurried composure. As Shanaa approached, he rose, his gaze softening in a way the public never saw. He reached out, his hand briefly covering hers on the table. "I have spent my life protecting territories and assets, Shanaa," he said, his voice a low, intimate tremor. "But I finally realized that the only thing worth truly guarding is the heart of a woman who knows her own value. You weren't a project to be saved. You were the light I didn't know I was searching for in the dark." He pulled out the chair opposite his for her. As she sat, the room around them seemed to fade into a soft blur. They were untouchable now, not because of a Mafia title or a billionaire's bank account, but because they had built a world where dignity was the highest currency. In the heart of the city that had once tried to crush them, the Waitress and the Protector finally shared a table, no longer alone, watching a new future unfold with effortless grace. Shanaa's success was a testament to the fact that resilience is the strongest foundation one can build, and that the scars of a hard-earned survival are actually the structural supports for a future that no bully can touch. In this new space, they showed the world that class is an action, not a bank account, and that integrity remains the only currency that never devalues. Minseong had used his power to restore balance, proving that true leadership is measured by how we treat those who can do nothing for us. In a world that often confuses attention with respect, they stood as a silent rebuke to the shallow entitlement of the elite. They understood that the best revenge isn't a strike, but a life lived so well and so honorably that your enemies become invisible in your shadow. They were untouchable now, two architects of a shared language built on discipline, honor, and a love that started with a simple, profound respect. If this story reminded you that your value is non-negotiable, hit the like button and subscribe to join our community of storytellers. Comment below with the word dignity if you believe that true love always starts with respect. Don't let the world make you feel small. Your foundation is stronger than you think. See you in the next story.